They called it a rebellion, but what if it was a cry for dignity? A desperate stand not just against colonial power, but against betrayal from within. In the heart of 20th century Abeokuta, a city carved from the rocky plains of southwestern Nigeria, women rose, not as victims, but as warriors. Their fight wasn't just against the British Empire. It was against their own kings. Abeokuta, a city born in resistance, its very name under the rock echoes survival. Founded in the early 1800s by the Egba people fleeing the ravages of Dahomean Slavers and internecine Yoruba wars, the city had always been a refuge. Its granite hills sheltered exiles, warriors, farmers, and traders. They built high walls, formed a confederacy of clans, and created a society that prized autonomy above all. But by the late 19th century, the British had arrived, and everything began to change. At first, the relationship between the Egba and the British was uneasy but cautious. The Egba United Government, a council of chiefs and elites, resisted direct colonial rule. They negotiated, they bartered, they held on to as much independence as they could. But in 1914, with the amalgamation of northern and southern Nigeria, the British solidified their grip. Abeokuta was folded into the colony, and control, once local, began to slip into foreign hands. But this story isn't just about the British. It's about what happens when a ruling elite turns its back on its people, especially its women. By the 1940s, a new system of indirect rule had taken root. The British governed through native authorities, a polite term for loyal local chiefs who would enforce colonial directives. One of them was the Alake of Egbaland, Obala Dopo Adamola II. Once a respected monarch, Adamola now found himself accused of becoming a puppet, more accountable to colonial officials than to his own people. For the women of Abeokuta, the betrayal cut deep. They were the lifeblood of the city's markets. Traders, artisans, cultivators, from dawn till dusk, they moved through the alleys of Ake, Itoku, and Sapon, baskets on their heads, money tied in their wrappers, deals struck with sharp eyes and quicker tongues. But under British taxation, their labor became a target. Direct taxation was imposed on women, many of whom couldn't vote, had no representation, and were given no say in how their money was spent. Worse still, the tax collectors, often corrupt, always male, and demanded payment with threats and insults. It was humiliation disguised. As governance, in 1946, a group of women began to organize. At the center was one woman, Funmilayo Ransom Kuti. Teacher, activist, daughter of Egba soil, and mother of the legendary Fela Kuti, Funmilayo had traveled. She'd studied in England. She understood both Yoruba customs and European hypocrisy, and she was furious. Along with other educated women, she founded the Abeokuta Women's Union, later known as the Nigerian Women's Union. Their mission: end the taxation of women and hold the Alake and his British sponsors accountable. Their protests weren't quiet. They sang, they danced, they marched by the thousands, wrapped in white and shouting through the streets of Abeokuta. Their songs were sharp, mocking. "Alake, you have become a woman," they sang, an insult not to femininity, but to the Oba's strength and integrity. They accused him of selling out his people, of groveling before white men for coins and clout. When police tried to silence them, they returned with louder voices. When chiefs dismissed them as unruly, they replied with petitions, meetings, and relentless organizing. British officials, used to pliant local opposition, were stunned. These were not rural, uninformed peasants. Many were literate, articulate, and politically astute, and they had numbers. Over 10,000 women mobilized. It wasn't just the tax. It was about power, about being heard in a society that had, slowly but steadily, erased their voice. You see, pre-colonial Yoruba society wasn't a patriarchy in the European sense. Women held titles, they led guilds. The Iolode, the recognized female leader, sat with kings and debated policy. But with colonialism came Victorian ideals and the assumption that women should be seen, not heard. Their political roles were dismantled. Their Voices ignored. Funmaleo and the women of Abeokuta demanded a return, not to the past but to balance. They demanded representation in local councils. They demanded the abolition of the flat rate tax on women. And they demanded the abdication of the Alake. And then, in one of the most shocking turns in Nigerian royal history, they won in January 1949 under mounting pressure. Oladapo Ademola II stepped down. It was unprecedented. A king removed not by war or British decree, but by the voices of market women. It sent shockwaves through Nigeria. British officials, wary of the precedent, scrambled to contain the fallout, but the fire had been lit. The Egba Uprising, as it came to be known, was not a bloody revolution. It was something subtler, a protest, a series of speeches, chants, petitions, and strategic resistance that exposed the cracks in colonial governance and traditional rule alike. It was also a warning that no king, no governor, no foreign empire could rule without the consent of its people, especially its women. And yet, the story did not end there. Oba Ademola would return to power in 1950, reinstated after reforms and backroom negotiations. Taxation policies were revised, and some women were allowed to vote in local councils. But the movement's spirit had already left Abeokuta and spread across Nigeria. Funmaleo Ransom Kuti went on to become one of the country's most prominent activists fighting for women's rights, national independence, and social justice until her death in 1978 under controversial and tragic circumstances following a raid by military forces on her home. Today, statues may stand in her honor, but how? Many remember that it was the women of Abeokuta, unarmed, defiant, and unapologetically vocal, who forced the king to his knees. Was this a unique uprising, or part of a larger pattern that history has deliberately silenced? In places like Aba in 1929, in Gold Coast markets, in the tea plantations of Sri Lanka and the rice paddies of Bengal, women, especially African and Asian women, rose in ways the West rarely taught in textbooks. Their protests were often dismissed as riots, their leaders labeled troublemakers, and their legacies buried under the headlines of empire. So the question lingers, like the morning fog over the Ogun River: how many more forgotten revolutions lie hidden beneath the pages of African history? And who else, like the women of Abeokuta, dared to whisper enough until their voices echoed like thunder? If you found this story as stirring as we did, help us keep these lost legacies alive. Like, share, and subscribe to History Off the Map, where we bring you stories the world forgot, but that history can no longer ignore. And let us know in the comments, should we uncover what really happened in the Aba Women's War of 1929 next? Or take you further into the secret rebellions of African queens and traders long erased by colonial pens? The next chapter might just change everything.